Hello, this is Morale, Study Coach UK, Story Time. Please subscribe. The stranger went into the little parlour of the Coach and Horses guest house about 5:30 in the morning, and there he remained until near midday. The blinds down, the door shut, and none after Hall's repulse venturing near him, and there he stayed. All that time he must have fasted. Thrice he rang his bell, and the third time furiously and continuously, but no one answered him. Him and his "go to the devil indeed," said Mrs. Hall. Presently came an imperfect rumour of the burglary at the vicarage, and two were then put together. Hall, assisted by Wadgers, went off and found Mr. Shackleford, the magistrate, and take his advice. No one ventured upstairs. How the stranger occupied himself is unknown. Now and then he would stride violently up and down, and twice came an outburst of curses, a tearing of paper, and a violent smashing of bottles. The little group of scared but curious people increased. Mrs. Huxter came over, some young fellows resplendent in black ready-made jackets and wearing paper ties. For, well, it was Whit Monday. They joined the group with confused interrogations. Young Archie Harker distinguished himself by going up the yard and trying to peep under the window blinds. But he could see nothing, but gave a reason for supposing that he did. And others of the Ipin youth presently joined him. It was the finest of all possible Whitmondays, and down the village street stood a row of nearly a dozen booths. There was a shooting gallery, and on the grass by the forge were 3 yellow and chocolate wagons, and some picturesque strangers of both sexes putting up a coconut shy. The gentlemen wore blue jerseys, the ladies white aprons and quite fashionable hats with heavy plumes. Watcher of the Purple Fawn and Mr. Jaggers, the cobbler, who also sold old second-hand ordinary bicycles, were stretching a string of Union Jacks and Royal Ensigns, which had originally been celebrated in the first Victorian Jubilee. And inside, in the artificial darkness of the parlour, into which only one thin jet of sunlight penetrated, the stranger, hungry, we must suppose, and fearful, hidden in his uncomfortable hot wrappings, poured through his dark glasses upon his paper or chinked his dirty little bottles. He occasionally swore savagely at the boys, audible, if invisible, outside the windows. In the corner by the fireplace lay the fragments of 6 smashed bottles, and a pungent twang of chlorine tainted the air. So much we know from what was heard at the time, and from what was subsequently seen in the room. About noon, he suddenly opened his parlour door and stood glaring fixedly at the 3 or 4 people in the bar. "Mrs. Hall," he said. Somebody then went sheepishly and called for Mrs. Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared after an interval. She was a little short of breath, but all the fiercer for that. Mrs. Hall had deliberately over this scene, and she came holding a little tray with an unsettled bill upon it. "It is your bill you're wanting, sir," she said. "Why wasn't my breakfast laid? Why haven't you prepared my meals and answered my bell? Do you think I live without eating?" he said. "Why isn't my bill paid?" said Mrs. Hall. "That's what I want to know. I told you 3 days ago I was awaiting a remittance. I told you 2 days ago I wasn't going to await no remittances. You can't grumble if your breakfast waits a bit. If my bill's been waiting these 5 days, can you?" The stranger swore briefly but vividly. "No," from the bar. "And I thank you kindly, sir. If you'd keep your swearing to yourself, sir," said Mrs. Hall. The stranger stood looking more like an angry, diving helmet than ever. It was universally felt in the bar that Mrs. Hall had the better of him. His next words showed as much. "Look here, my good woman," he began. "Don't good woman me," said Mrs. Hall. "I've told you my remittance hasn't come." "Remittance indeed," said Mrs. Hall. "Still, I dare say, in my pocket. You told me 3 days ago that you hadn't anything but a sovereign's worth of silver upon you. Well, I found some more." "Hello," from the bar. "I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. That seemed to annoy the stranger very much. He stamped his foot. "What do you mean?" he said. "That I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. "And before I take my bills or get any breakfast or do any such things whatsoever, you got to tell me 1 or 2 things I don't understand. And what nobody don't understand, and what everybody is very anxious to understand. I want to know what you been doing to my chairs upstairs, and I want to know how 'tis your room was empty and how you got in again. Them as stops in this house comes in by the doors. That's the rule of the house, and that you didn't do. And what I want to know is how you did come in. And I want to know." Suddenly, the stranger raised his gloved hands, clenched, stamped his foot, and said, "Stop!" with such extraordinary violence that he silenced her instantly. "You don't understand," he said. "Who I am? Or what I am? I'll show you. By heavens, I'll show you." Then he put his open palm over his face and withdrew it. The centre of his face became a black cavity. "Here," he said. He stepped forward and handed Mrs. Hall something which she, staring at his metamorphosed face, accepted automatically. Then, when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, dropped it, and staggered back. The nose. It was the stranger's nose, pink and shining, rolled on the floor. Then he removed his spectacles, and everyone in the bar gasped. He took off his hat, and with a violent gesture tore at his whiskers and bandages. For a moment they resisted him. A flash of horrible anticipation passed through the bar. Oh my God! And someone